I'll be presenting what's new in Ubuntu 18.04. I want to talk about that a little bit. Canonical is the company that supports Ubuntu, which is one flavor of Linux. The way they number their releases, I was just looking at this, obviously 18 for the year. 04 is their April release. They release twice a year. The next release will be 18.10. And they have alphabetic code names for their releases. Obviously, this one's Bionic Beaver. They've run through the alphabet once already. This will be the 28th support release of Ubuntu in the last 14 years. That's pretty impressive. So why can I not get my, oh, there we go. So this is the user interface of a stock Ubuntu 18.04. Obviously, it's highly configurable. You can move things around on the desktop, change wallpapers. They're all pretty much like that. So anyway, new features. The Beaver is now using GNOME instead of Unity. Canonical struck out on its own 4 or 5 years ago with a new user interface called Unity. It was quite controversial at the time. It hasn't come along as much as they'd liked, and they've dropped They've dropped it as the default for the user interface in Ubuntu, and I want to talk about that a little bit. Linux is highly modular. The user interface is one module of what they call a Linux distribution, and a distribution is all the pieces and parts that put it together like a car. With Microsoft, they name the OS and the user interface the same, Windows. That's not the case with Linux. You have your choice of user interfaces. And Canonical, we'll talk more about that, but Canonical with the Beaver is now gone back to GNOME. And it's GNOME 3. That was a major upgrade from GNOME 2. With this release, they've finally gone to something called systemd. When a computer starts up, there's a whole sequence of commands that are issued by the operating system to start up all the necessary services and stuff. In the past, they had a rote script of things that to be started, and frequently you didn't need those services. Those were called init scripts. And 3 or 4 years ago, systemd was developed. It's a lot smarter about when to start things and what sequence. It won't start them until they're needed. As a result, not only does the system boot quicker, but applications, when they start, will start quicker. So that's an improvement. So they've got a new installation option. If you're going to use this installation of 18.04, you can choose to only install a bare bones system. You might want to do that if you were going to maybe dedicate it as a web server or run it only for video editing or something like that. So it's nice to have that option. Excuse me. They originally were going to install kernel 4.14, but they've decided to move forward with kernel 4.15. A little bit about that. The Linux kernel developers for quite a few years now have a set timed release of about 6 weeks per release. The Linux Torvalds opens a window for patches, and everybody contributes their patches for about 2 weeks. Then they release an alpha version, and everybody tests, and they do regression testing on all that. And when he's satisfied with it, he'll typically release, I don't know, 6 or 7 release candidates, and then it will be released. And then it is up to the compilers of the Linux distributions decide if they want to take it or not. Just as an FYI, kernel 4.17 was released this week. Typically, depending on how the distribution, how aggressive they are about bringing in new releases, you might see this in Ubuntu in, I don't know, 1904, maybe 1910. And they're all incremental improvements. There's typically nothing radical in the releases. So the display server is what puts the GUI on your screen. It's the one that yanks the windows around and stuff like that. There was Xorg was created by the X organization over 20 years ago with the first Unix computers, and it has a lot of nice features, but being that old, it has a lot of bit rot, digital cruft in it, and it was never designed for security. And as a result, it's quite bulky and a little bit crash prone. And about 4 years ago, a streamlined display manager called Wayland came on the stream, and it's matured quite a lot, but Canonical has found a few applications that still don't play nice with it. So they've reverted back to Xorg for a little bit. You can run Ubuntu under Wayland. You can select it when you log in, and you can try it. I suspect it'll be fine for 99% of the users. So I don't have any information on this, but they say they made some incremental file improvements on the Nautilus file manager. They've updated the welcome screen. It's actually the stock GNOME screen, which they've customized for Ubuntu. And they've tweaked the help pages. They've put in some basics on how to do things on the GNOME desktop. And I want to talk about that a little bit. You don't actually use Linux. You use the user interface. All the stuff that Linux does is behind the screens to help you do what you want to do with files and browsing and the like. So 1804 will be collecting some system usage data unless you opt out. It is anonymized. And they explained that what they're doing is finding out, if there's crash reports, they may collect those, and also to find out what people use the most, and they'll focus their development resources on those. So unless you're totally paranoid, I would suggest helping them and just, letting it do its thing. So, easier live patching. All the distributions release patches periodically. Those patches can consist of security patches. Some of them could be critical, some could be not so critical. A lot of the other patches are bug fixes for various applications. Some of the other errata they release could be improvements and enhancements. Typically, you can install all of those whenever they're released. I highly recommend for any OS you're running, you stay up on the patches. It's really important these days. But one of the things that most Linuxes can't do is install a new kernel without rebooting. About 3 or 4 years ago, someone developed a method of doing on-the-fly kernel patching, and Ubuntu has finally rolled that in to their releases. So that's a good thing, especially if you run a machine that you really don't want to reboot. Companies frown on that, especially when they got highly critical enterprise applications that need to be up 24/7. And I know you've all been waiting for color emojis. This got quite a bit of fun poked at it, but they did release them. Formerly, some versions were black and white and gray, but in all its glory, here are all the new emojis. So I know your life is complete with emojis in Ubuntu now. There were some miscellaneous other changes. Intel developed a user interface, not a user interface, an interface, electrical interface called Thunderbolt 6 or 7 years ago, and it's slowly gaining in acceptance on motherboards. So you'll start seeing that. The third version uses the USB-C interface connector, which is a good thing because you can plug it in either direction. Thunderbolt 1 and 2 use the mini DisplayPort connector. So they've gone to USB-C. Thunderbolt's pretty cool. I was reading up on it. I don't have any machines that support it, but it has a PCI Express. That's the electrical interface of a PCIe slot in a desktop computer. It's very fast, very competent, but you could have a remote plug-in box on your desk that needs a PCIe interface, and you can support it with a skinny little Thunderbolt Type 3 cable. Or an external monitor that uses DisplayPort, which is, well, you had VGA and then DVI and HDMI, and everybody's going to DisplayPort now. So now you could string 2 or 3 monitors together with a Thunderbolt 3 cable. Additionally, you can power those devices over it. It has, I don't know, at least several amps of power available through that cable. So that means no external DC power for any monitor that might use a Thunderbolt 3 interface. So that's one less wire on the desk. So that's a good thing. And you can string up to 6 things out on that cable. I haven't seen it, but I assume they have an in and out on each device, so you can string them serially. Apparently this wasn't implemented or configurable before, but if you're running your laptop on battery and you don't do anything for 20 minutes, it will go into suspend. So that's a good thing. Power management on Linux has lagged behind Windows for a number of years, and they started paying attention to it, I don't know, 4 or 5, 6 years ago, and have been making gradual improvements on that, and it's now reasonably good. So they've brought up the version of LibreOffice to 6.0. For those that don't know, LibreOffice is a fork of OpenOffice. A little history there. OpenOffice came from StarOffice, which was a German company, in the late 90s. It was an office suite that was available for Windows, Mac, and Linux. It wasn't real popular. Sun bought it, the company, and released it as OpenOffice. I guess I'll go into the rest of the history. Sun's management of OpenOffice was not real good, their stewardship, but it progressed. It came out as OpenOffice 3, and then Sun was bought by Oracle. And the stewardship of OpenOffice went from bad to awful. There were hundreds and hundreds of patches that had been contributed that weren't being released. So about 6 or 7 years ago, the community was fed up, and they said, okay, that's it. And they took the source code, which is completely legal because it's open source, took the source code of OpenOffice and spun it off into a new release. They asked Oracle if they could reuse the OpenOffice name, and Oracle gave them the legal middle finger, so it became LibreOffice. The first release of LibreOffice incorporated 400 patches as a catch-up, and 95% of all the developers stampeded over to LibreOffice, and off we went. Since then, it's been improved and improved. Backwards compatibility with Microsoft Documents has been steadily improved. And by the way, the default file format of LibreOffice is what they call open document format. It is an ISO standard. You can, if you adopt your documents to the ISO standard, no matter where they're created, LibreOffice can read and write them. So that's a good thing. So LibreOffice 6.0 was released last October. Its end of life is this November. But fear not, 6.1 is already available, and it will probably be available for updating in Ubuntu in, I don't know, a month or so. If you're diligent about applying all of your updates when they appear, you'll notice someday that LibreOffice has become 6.1. That's the kind of nice thing about Linux going on over time. you notice submenus have new features and things work a little smoothly. It's all about that continuous improvement process. One thing that Ubuntu is doing is what some of the other distributions have started doing. They're dropping release of 32-bit versions of their Linux distributions. There aren't hardly any people running 32-bit computers anymore. If you're bound and determined to run that really old doorstop, that 32-bit computer, there are a few older, more conservative Linux distributions that are still releasing 32-bit versions. Me, I haven't. It's been 15 years since I've had a 32-bit distribution. Okay, I want to talk about this so it has some meaning. Back in the old days, when computer hardware was really expensive, especially RAM, they used what they call virtual memory. If you ran out of main RAM, you took programs in RAM that weren't being used and you wrote them off to disk. That's called virtual memory, or a swap partition and a swap file. The good thing about that is it kept the computer running when it was really tight on RAM. The bad thing about it is when you're swapping, that's a kiss of death to performance, because disk I/O is way slower than RAM access. So, and this is true with all OSs. Don't ever run your computer short on memory. That being said, even if you have sufficient memory, computer operating systems still use a bit of swap space as kind of scratch pad memory. So, back in the old days, they put them on disk partitions. When Linux came along, they added the ability to swap to a file. When they originally released that, the performance of swapping to a file was a little poorer than swapping to a partition, but the performance of swapping to a file is up on a parity now. So they're just going to a swap file. And the good thing about a swap file is you can move it around, and it doesn't have any special file format, whereas a swap partition had to be pretty much built as part of the installation. So that makes it a little easier. So file encryption has become a big deal these days. They used to let you allow, when they first brought out encryption for Linux, the main thrust was encrypting the home directory, but now they're forcing you to encrypt everything. And there used to be a bit of a performance impact in encrypting disk partitions, but not so much anymore. So, if you want a new to-do app in GNOME, they have it. Looks like it has all the typical features. I've not used it yet. Nice to bring out new features, new applications too. So I want to talk a little bit about what I mentioned earlier. Microsoft only provides the one UI, and that's fine. That's their product brand. But in Linux, you have your choice, just like you have your choice of car models when you go to the showroom. It would be weird to walk into a car showroom and just see one flavor of car there. And I was talking about the graphical user interface. That's that mousy clicky thing you use on the screen. Linux being open source, anybody can create their own graphical user interface. I could have Orv's GUI out there, Beach GUI, I guess. And I could put it on top of Orvnix or something if I wanted to. But most people use the top 3 or 4 user interfaces. So Ubuntu uses GNOME 3.x, the latest version by default. Plasma is from the group known as KDE. That is my preference, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. I like it a lot. Cinnamon was created by these old reactionary Linux users when GNOME went to version 3. Like any new release, version 3.0.0 of GNOME was a little buggy and they preferred GNOME too, so they created a user interface based on it called Cinnamon. So you can install that. There's also another user interface based on the old GNOME. It's spelled mate, but it's pronounced Matei, I heard. I just learned that the other day. And you can still install Unity on Ubuntu. It's still available. And again, there's a group of people who've come to prefer it, and they will continue supporting it outside of Canonical. That's the nice thing about open source. It's kind of like the squeaky wheel. Programs that are really popular get a lot of support. Those that aren't popular fade away. It's kind of like evolution. So here is the default user interface for KDE. The reason I liked it is because when it first came out, again, many years ago, it had the typical start menu and pop-up menu. And this is still what it looks like. You've got the favorites tab down there, and then a whole list of applications and some other stuff. There's Cinnamon. Looks pretty much like all the others. And again, remember, all of these are highly configurable. There's Matei, again, based on GNOME 2.0, which kind of looks a lot like GNOME 3.0 to me. I have a coworker who prefers Matei because he doesn't like GNOME 3. He's an old Linux fart. And I'm not sure which this one is. I think this is a tweaked version of Cinnamon also. And again, you can see there are menus and submenus and stuff like that. So that's the end of the formal presentation. We can either do two things here. We can do Q&A now, or I can run through a show and tell of Ubuntu 18.04. What's everybody's preferences?
They can't tell you, only I can tell you. And we've got a time, so I think a little bit of a show and tell would be good. But before we do that, let me throw out the question that a lot of people would have. And you're a Fedora person, I'm a Mint person, but it still is a relative question. Updating from like 17x to 18.04, can that be done without reinstalling all the added programs and user data?
Yes, almost all distributions have a mechanism for doing an on-the-fly upgrade. Matter of fact, this morning I just upgraded 2 machines from Fedora 27 to Fedora 28. And it looks a little different on each distribution, but it's basically you point your computer at the repository out on the internet for the new release. It downloads all the updated packages, reboots and installs them, then reboots on the new kernel. And there is a method to do that, and you can Google it. I'm sure it's very well documented for Ubuntu.
Yeah, I think the one thing that we in our group talk about is that if you've added a program to, let's say, 17.10 that might not have been tested out by Canonical for 18.04, then there might be a possibility that that program and that version of the program might have to be reinstalled to a version that will work on 18.04. But
well, let's talk about that. Typically, you get your programs only from the canonical repositories. And all of those, when they release a new version, in this case 18.04, all of the programs in the 18.04 repository have been recompiled for 18.04. Now, if you go off to a third-party repository, that is true. You may have to uninstall it or reinstall it. Typically, the upgrade process will tell you, I can't do anything with this, and it'll either stop or not upgrade it or something, and then it's on you to fix it. But since you've installed it from a third-party repository, you can go and get it, and if they've not updated it, you can complain to the supporters, say, hey, get this up to date. I want to run it on 18.04. Most of the major, I would say the great majority of popular applications are already in the main repositories.
Yeah, I'd agree. Sometimes the newest version of something might come out and the repository doesn't have it, and so somebody will go out. I was going to ask a question on the Fedora. Do they have point releases in Fedora like they do in Ubuntu?
Yes. Like I said, they just went from Fedora 27 to Fedora 28, and it's about every 6 months.
Okay, because there has been instructions said that you might not be able to go from 1610 to 1804 without jumping to 17.4, 1710, and then to 1804 without doing a clean install.
Back up your data first. That's all I would say if you're going to try that. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
I did do a Fedora 25 to 27 update. That particular upgrade process has and I do it on the command line because I'm old school, but you can give it permission to erase programs that it can't upgrade, and then you just reinstall them from that existing repository where you got it from.
That's good. That's good.
It is. And the process. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, with that, did you want to make any kind of comment about the fact that 1804 being a long-term support, what that means different than just a plain 1804?
Yeah, sure. Now, you have to know what you're getting. Long-term support, which means they will provide patches for 5 years. Unlike Fedora, which is, I don't know, I don't want to call it bleeding edge, but more aggressive than others. They only support for 6 months. It's good to have 5-year support, but remember, they don't support everything for 5 years. They will do security patches and bug fixes, but I think it becomes increasingly limited beyond that.
Yeah, so I think it's good for somebody who doesn't want to have to be updating lots of computers in a work setting every 6 months, but that gives individual choice. We Linux people have that choice. Yeah, so why not? Let's go ahead, since we've got time to see a live one. It's always bad when you just do shows. You don't really see it, but go ahead and do the show and tell, because we've had a number of people that have voted for that.
Okay, let me see if I can figure out how to do this here.
Just share your desktop by closing out the your Impress.
All right.
Oh, I'm sorry, you were using PowerPoint.
I was, because this is my work. This is my work laptop because I have no Microsoft laptops.
Okay. Yeah, you could have done it the other way.
And there's my company. So let me talk a little bit about how to run Linux. There's 3 options. You can find an older computer, and it can be moderately old, not Windows XP vintage, but maybe Vista vintage, 20 gigs of disk space, 2 gigs of RAM, and dedicate that to a straight Linux install. That works very, very well. You can alternatively trim down your C drive, free up about 20 gigs of spare disk space, and install Linux there. And then when you boot up, you have the option of starting Windows or Linux. The third option, which I'm going to demonstrate here, is running Linux as a virtual machine. It sits in a file on Windows, and it starts up and runs, and Windows acts as the host. The possibly downside of that is they both share the same pool of RAM. So if your Windows machine is a little tight on RAM, that might not work as well as you like. But it's nice to have all the options. So the software I use is called Oracle VirtualBox, which is open source. And you can have multiple VMs here, and you can run them all at the same time, assuming your host machine, in this case Windows 10, has enough horsepower. So I'm going to boot up this Ubuntu demo box here. You see that, John?
I turn my mic off. Yes.
Okay. Now, you'll notice this isn't, if you've used Ubuntu before, this is not the default login screen. The login screen on Linux is called the Display Manager. And like everything else, there are multiple choices. There's the old GDM, GNOME Desktop Display Manager. There's KDM, the old KDE Display Manager. There are newer versions of them, and they're all moving them to, there's one called LightDM, Lightweight Display Manager, and another one called SDM, or SDDM, and I don't know what that stands for. In any case, this is not GDM. So it remembers the last person, and by the way, you have to remember that Linux can have multiple user accounts, and if there were more than one account it created on this virtual machine, you would see the multiple names here, and you could pick them. Here's where the password goes. That's a no-brainer. But even more interestingly, I didn't talk about it, but if you wanted to run KDE Plasma on Ubuntu, you don't have to dump Ubuntu and load Kubuntu, which is the version that comes with it by default. You can load as many of those UIs on your Ubuntu machine you want and pick which one you want to run at login time. And the way you do that is you click here, and you can see I've loaded Matei, Plasma, and you can see Ubuntu default is now Xorg or Ubuntu on Wayland. So let's log into Ubuntu on Wayland. It's not going to look any different. So there you go. You've got all your usual applications. I don't use the GNOME interface much, but you can select your applications here. And you can either click one or you can search. And they've got some canned applications over here. And over here, this is where they have all their login and log out stuff. So I'm going to log out. And I'm going to say, I want to log into KDE Plasma. My bias is towards Plasma because, well, I've been using it forever. And you can see I've customized the desktop. It's got the pop-up menu. These are my favorites. These are the applications. And again, you can do multimedia and you can add stuff. Let's try the Software Center just for grins. These are things, applications, application add-ons, you can search. All the Linux distributions have a feature like this where you can install applications via an application, a GUI application. Me, I'm old school. I do all command line, but you know that's optional. One of the things I really like about KDE is their file manager, and it's called Dolphin. You can view the pictures. I was using these when I developed the presentation, downloads, documents, desktop, public. Or the nice thing about this one, you can split it and drag from place to place. So, oh, and when you view a picture, it starts up an image, a graphics application called GwenView. I have no idea why it's called that, but it lets you do rudimentary operations, like if I wanted to, like I did on this one, crop this. And again, all the applications have something like that. I'm doing it in KDE because I'm familiar with that. There you go. So we're done with that. we will. I can write. You have. There's lots of options to do something in Linux. I could leave like this. Log out is up here, or there's a right-click application menu, submenu. So I'm going to log out. Let's try Matei. It's always fun to explore these different user interfaces. And again, it kind of looks like just like we saw. We could play Mahjong or Isle Right. This is the bare minimum installed. If you want to, let's see if we can install an application. How do we do that? Let's see. System tools. Or is it administration? Not me. Software and updates. Let's see if there's any updates out there. Let's see. How do I do this? Oh, this one's set to do daily. So how do we? Anybody out there run Matei? I'll tell you what. Somebody say yes?
Oh, well, yeah. There's a software updater. You just saw it.
Oh, there it is. Yeah. Thank you. That was good to get participation from the audience. So it says it can't get to the internet. Well, obviously I'm on the internet. It's possible that the, I suspect what's going on is that the company required VPN is not letting this VM go out to the internet. I'm not able to disable that, so we won't be able to demo that. This is running in VirtualBox. You can full scale this, you can get rid of the menus and stuff. Additionally, there are some VirtualBox guest editions, and if you install those, you can drag and drop between Linux and Windows, text files and stuff, pictures. Very handy. I tried that the other day and it works fine. He said. Let's try. We could try that, I guess. Let's see. How do I run something here? I want to run. Tell you what, I'm going to run. gedit is the GNOME editor. I think I tried this before. Let me start up Notepad. This is a test. Okay. Control C that. Let's see if we can paste it. There we go. It's always nice when something works and you haven't tested it. So, and this is the what they would call the command interface or terminal in Windows. It's a terminal. It's a console in Linux. And just to talk a little bit about that, if you are from the old DOS days, you remember there were, I don't know, a couple of hundred DOS commands that were available to you, but day to day you probably only used a dozen of them. You know, change directory, delete a file, make a directory, stuff like that. In Linux on the console, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of commands. But in day-to-day operation, it's those same 12 commands, and some of them even have the same name. So it's fun to, like, do they have dir in here? No. Oh, they do. There you go. Same stuff. Talk a little bit more about Linux and security. Historically, but not so much now, fortunately, Windows has been a security nightmare. They still have to deal with it because they're a big target, but to their credit, Microsoft, with Windows 10 especially, and a bit before that, has been very diligent in the background closing up the security loopholes they find. Linux was developed using the Unix model of security, which by default is substantially more secure than bolting on security like Microsoft has had to do. It's very hard to hack a Linux computer. That being said, you need to be diligent about patching. Always patch. But there, for example, there's no antivirus, especially for Linux, and most of the time when you hear about Linux hacks or websites getting hacked, it's because there was an opening in one of the applications. Either they didn't keep it up to the most current version, or in a lot of cases, they left the default application password in, like admin. So you get what you deserve in that case. So I don't have much more unless there are any other questions, John?
Yeah, I've got something for you. If we do have any non-Linux users, I think they would find it very interesting that when running Linux, we can access Windows and all of their files, but Windows doesn't even see Linux.
Yeah, Microsoft is pretty Windows-centric, although, well, I'll get to that, but you can use RDP from Linux to Windows. You can mount Windows files. Actually, I don't know if I can do that or not. Let me see their file manager. Where is their file manager? Let's see. Accessories, files. Here we go. I don't think I have this set up. Let's see. It's searching for networks. I don't know if I have this set up to see my Windows laptop files. I do have that set up at work. That's a little different. That's a Windows 7 VM running on a Linux machine. Oh, well, let's see what this says. Okay. Now let's try that again, because I just saw something that might work. No, this is just the stuff on the Linux machine, but it can be done. I should have thought about that and set that up.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's the one question I'm going to modify to make it easier for you to answer. One of our attendees said that Mint offers support for proprietary software, and the question is, can you add repositories to your Fedora to get that same support for proprietary software?
Yes, if the proprietary software is compiled to run on Fedora and they have a repository that's formatted like Fedora expects, then yeah, sure, you can do add a repo list. It's called a repository, and the name of the configuration file that points to the repository is whatever the name of the software is, .repo, and it's in a yum repository directory. And when yum, or in the case of Fedora, DNF, which is the command line software updater, goes out to look for updates, it will look at all of the repositories it possesses. And from then on, if that proprietary software releases an update, Fedora will see it. And if you allow it and authorize it, it will download it and install it, yes.
Yeah. So and it would do the same thing for Ubuntu, but it would have to be in the format that Ubuntu uses, which is a little bit different than Fedora, but it's based off the Debian. So yeah, so you should be able to add that. Now, I think that the Conical would warn you that just because you add something yourself doesn't mean we'll always support something or fix something when you're going outside of the family.
That's correct. I mean, that's true for any vendor of any operating system. Once you add something on there that isn't specifically provided or supported by them, you're on your own. Typically in the Linux and open source world, that's not as risky as you might assume. They're pretty well vetted.
Good. If there are any other questions, you can throw them into the chat box. I think the one thing that Orv didn't say that we all say is you can give this a try because Linux is totally free. And so just like test driving cars, you can go and test drive Linux and play with it, and it's not going to cost you a penny to try it. And
That's right. A lot of people spend a lot of time jumping from Linux distribution to Linux distribution, and that's what they do. But Linuxes are a lot like cars. They all have four wheels, they all have a transmission, they all have an engine. The only difference is when you get inside, where are the radio controls, where do you turn on the seat heaters, stuff like that. That's what you have to learn. And that's all about the user interface.
Exactly. Sounds like one of my presentations that I do.
For those who haven't tried it, I really encourage it to. Linux is very, believe it or not, user-friendly on the user interface. They worked very hard on that. It's very transparent. It's very easy to learn without even trying a lot of network and computer stuff just because it's so open and transparent.
All right. I'd like to, or APCUG, again, thanks Orv for, and the attendees for being a part of this. Orv does quite a bit with the Scale, which is that Southern California Linux Expo, the largest, probably, I don't know, is it, can I say it's the largest in the world?
No, but it's the largest in the continent. It's largest North American one.
Yeah.